Hello, my friends. This is the 8th video in a series of videos on terminology and notation in vibrational astrology. This will probably be the last video in this series. We'll see if I get through all the rest of the material in this video. And there are three things I want to talk about. I want to talk about number one, a terminology that we do not use in VA and how we describe certain things without special terminology. Number two, power patterns. I want to go over a few kind of power patterns. And three, some spreading patterns that are common and you might not be aware of how common they are and how to think about them and how we see them. So a little bit more on power patterns and spreading patterns. And first, about terminology we do not use. Here's an example of terminology that special labels, let's call it that way, special labels that we do not use in VA would be this configuration here we looked at the end of the previous video. In my 43 vibration chart, Mars is trine the triple conjunction of Mercury, Jupiter, and Pluto. So it's a power trine to this triple conjunction. And Sun is sextile. So there's a power sextile to that same triple conjunction. And it's a spreading pattern because if it was not spreading, it would be a sextile trine pattern. Now, what I want to point out is that I'm calling it a sextile trine pattern. I'm just giving a label to this configuration based on the aspects in the configuration. Again, I'm calling it a spreading. Actually, it's a power, be more specific, it's a power, because of that triple conjunction, it's a power spreading sextile trine. Well, sextile trine, some people say it's kind of clumsy language. Can't we have some cool name for it? Do I really have to say sextile trine? Doesn't roll off the tongue very nicely. I mean, come on, can't we get something better? Well, we could. Do you really want it? You're going to have to memorize all these names, and they've already been named. We don't have to create new names. So, for example, in the Huber system, that's a system of astrology that uses a lot of modern ideas with some interesting innovations. They have a large number of names for patterns, and the sextile trine is called a small talent triangle. So we could call it a small talent triangle. We could call it a spreading small talent triangle. Is there a big advantage over that of calling it a spreading sextile trine pattern? I would say I don't think so, because Huber system, that's great, because Huber system doesn't use a lot of midpoints and all these supersymmetry patterns and isotraps, and it's a different language. It's focusing a lot on different ideas, and one of them is basic planetary patterns. The number of patterns we have in VA is enormous because we have 16 vibration 16 harmonic aspects within, like these dashed lines. I mean, so many aspects, so many possible configurations. So I just wanted to mention, for those of you who are familiar with all these different names of patterns, in VA we don't use them. There's a big trade-off here. Do you want to memorize all this stuff? And I'm saying, no, let's not do that. So there are so many, you'd have many more patterns using VA than you have in the Huber system. Huber system already has an enormous number. So in VA, we use the more verbose terms. So we just say sextile trine. The only configurations that we have labels for are the most obvious ones: grand trine, T-square, grand cross, also the kite. I think you're all familiar with the kite. I won't show it here. It's like a grand trine with a fourth point opposition one of the points in the grand trine. Yod. We do use the yod, two quincunxes and a sextile. Those configurations are so widely used. Almost everybody knows them, and we do use them in VA. But there are other ones that are somewhat common, but we don't use them. Maybe at some future point, if we feel it's important, we could incorporate them. but right now we don't. And my feeling is I think we'll just probably keep it this way. Why add all this terminology? I don't think it's worth it. And I wanted to just go over that so that you're aware of it. We're using labels for only the most popular and often labeled aspect patterns. Now, okay, let's look at this. What soft aspect pattern, so that covers that. Let's now move on to power configurations and spreading configurations. What soft aspect patterns do you see in Angela Davis's natal chart? You can pause the video before looking at the next slide. By the way, Angela Davis was a political activist, or she's still alive, I should say, is a political activist who was in the news around, especially in the 60s and early 70s. And she is a professor and continues teaching. Now that she's in her 70s, she still does that. Anyway, if you're curious who she is. What soft aspect pattern does she have? I think this is pretty straightforward. You can stop the video before I continue, but I will continue. 1, 2, 3, go. It's a power grand trine. Well, that's pretty simple. She has a power grand trine of Sun, Neptune, and a Mars-Uranus conjunction. Sun and Neptune are both trine Mars and Uranus, and notice it is not spreading. It is not spreading because Sun is within orb to both Mars and Uranus. We see that because both aspect lines are there, and Neptune is trine both the Mars and Uranus. We see that because both aspect lines are there. We also notice none of these aspect lines is thin. This Sun trine Neptune's a little thinner than the others, but it's solid. I mean, it's not weak. This is a very tight, we can call it a very tight power grand trine. It's the tightest power grand trine in the entire database of over 20,000 people with AA data. So it's unusually clear and sharp. There's also a spreading Sun, Mars, Neptune, Pluto kite pattern. And this you might not notice as clearly because of all these big, strong oppositions might have clouded the view of this. The fact that all these other lines are so thick might have obscured the fact that we actually have a spreading kite, because Mars is sextile Pluto and the Pluto sextile Neptune is out of orb. But if it was within orb, you'd have a perfect kite. A kite is a grand trine with one planet opposition one of the points in the grand trine, and it looks like a kite. But it's easy to overlook. I think the reason it's easy to overlook is because so many other aspects are so exact. This sesquiquadrat, this opposition, these trines. You see these big fat lines and these big glyphs. The little bit weaker sextile and the line missing, but it is a kite. Pluto comes in and makes a kite in this grand trine. So it's a spreading kite. Anyway, just a little exercise. She has a tight power grand trine and she has a spreading kite with the same planets. Okay, how would you describe this square aspect between a Mars-Pluto conjunction and the Venus-Jupiter conjunction? Look at it and think about it. This is my 7 vibration chart. Hint, keep it simple. So there's an art to this. You get better at it with time, and we're just practicing a little bit. How would you describe my Mars-Pluto square the Venus-Jupiter? You can pause the video, and I will continue if you want to think about it some more. Okay, I'm going to continue now. Well, there's a lot of good ways to describe it. You could call it a spreading power square aspect. It's good if your words right at the beginning tell you what you're talking about. A spreading power square aspect. That terminology, 4 words, packs in a good description. Spreading power square aspect. Spreading means they're not all within orb. Power means there's at least a conjunction. So in that few words, in 4 words, we describe basically what we're talking about, and then we can fill in the details. So one of the arts of communication is to convey the basic idea and then fill in the details. So a good description, not the only one, but a good one, is a spreading power square aspect between a Mars-Pluto conjunction and a Venus-Jupiter conjunction. Now, we don't know which of those aspects is in orb and which is out of orb, but in a short, in a brief description, we've conveyed pretty clearly what's going on. A spreading power square aspect between a Mars-Pluto conjunction and a Venus-Jupiter conjunction gives a very good idea of what we're talking about. You can also add the word power, or same as above. We don't have the word power. We could add the word power. Oh, no, we have the word power. We can remove the word power. So instead of a spreading power square, you could just say you don't really need the word power. You could say a spreading square between a Mars-Pluto conjunction and a Venus-Jupiter conjunction. I like using the word power. It just really brings to mind that it's an aspect that normally would not have these additional planets, but the conjunctions add to it. You may not think of using the word power, and you might just say, well, you've got a Mars-Pluto conjunction square a Venus-Jupiter conjunction, and it's spreading. Sometimes you explain it as you see it. You say, well, what do I see here? I see Mars-Pluto conjunction is square a Venus-Jupiter conjunction, and it's spreading, because I notice the Mars-Jupiter line is not drawn in. And let's see, the Venus-Mars is also not drawn in. So not all the lines are there. So it's a spreading power conjunction. A power square, power square. Now another way to say it is you could say a spreading Venus-Jupiter conjunction square a Mars-Pluto conjunction. That's a good description. It's basically the same thing said above, just different, ordering the words a little bit different. Another way you could say a Venus-Jupiter conjunction is square a Mars-Pluto conjunction, and the pattern is spreading. All of these are just essentially the same word stated a little bit differently. It's good to go over this. It's good to, when I say it, it may be obvious, but what happens is when you're looking at a chart and you're trying to find the words like, blah, 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 what is it I'm looking at here? Just keep it simple. It's a Mars-Pluto conjunction, square Venus-Jupiter conjunction, and it's spreading. And if you think of it, add the word power. There's a power square between a Mars-Pluto conjunction and a Venus-Jupiter, between a Mars-Pluto conjunction and a Venus-Jupiter conjunction. And if you don't remember to say the word spreading, you can just say, and it's spreading. Just to let them know it's not everything's within orb. Okay. Now, the number of possible planetary configurations is almost endless. Like in this particular wheel for Buddy Holly, notice the semi-square configuration. Moon is semi-square Pluto, Pluto is semi-square Sun, Sun is square Moon. It's weak. How do I know it's weak? Because the lines are weak. You don't have to look at the planets and calculate the orbs. You can just look at how thick the lines are if you're using a wheel style that has these varying width lines. This is set up with the orbs we use in vibrational astrology, so we can just look at the thickness and know that's a weak pattern. And we do not have a special term for this pattern. We just call it a semi-square-Square pattern. So just emphasizing, you see a pattern like this, you know what happens sometimes? The astrologer doesn't have a name for it. In VA, we don't have a name for it. And so, well, we don't have a name for it, must not be that important. Whoa, holy moly, man. Yeah, the cart is leading the horse here. The fact we don't have a label for it doesn't mean it's not important. It just means we don't want to burden you with a lot of terminology. So the fact we don't give names to these doesn't mean they're not just as important as some other configuration that does have a name. So I want to emphasize that as well. There's all these subtle ways in which you can get, an incorrect sense just by assuming certain things. We don't have a label for it because we don't want to burden you with labels. It's an extremely important configuration. Okay. And as I said before, it would be convenient to have special names for all these configurations, but then we would need to memorize them. And in VA, the number of configurations is huge. Okay, here's another example just to practice. Here's a midpoint tree you see on the right side. Sun is at Moon, Mercury midpoint, Venus, Mars midpoint, and Venus, Jupiter midpoint. If you were to write it out, you could write it like this. Sun equals Moon, Moon, Mercury midpoint equals Venus, Mars midpoint equals Venus, Jupiter midpoint. So how would you describe this midpoint configuration? There's several different ways to describe it. How would you describe it? Well, first of all, it has an isotrap. Sun at Moon, Mercury midpoint, and Venus, Mars is an isotrap. All five are different. There's also the Sun at Moon, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter. If you remove Venus, Mars, and just think about Moon, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, that is an isotrap. So the only difference between the Sun, between those two configurations, let me say that differently. These two isotraps, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, they both share the planet Venus. So those isotraps are overlapping. They're not independent of each other. And when you see a planet repeated like Venus, that means Mars and Jupiter are conjunct. So there's a power element going on. So you're noticing there's an isotrap, there's a power thing going on. You might be at a loss for words, and you don't have to complicate it. So what we can do here is we can say that the Sun makes 3 midpoint structures, and it includes an isotrap. Good enough, okay? You don't have to drive yourself crazy picking up every fine nuance to describe the pattern. It's just like if I say, my friend Joe is a musician, I don't have to start telling you what kind of music he plays and blah, blah, blah. Just get the basic idea. If you're going to meet somebody at an airport and you never met them before, you just give an idea of how tall they are, a few things. You don't need to write an entire biography. So for this pattern, I think it makes sense to say the Sun makes 3 midpoint structures, and it includes an isotrap. Actually, it includes more than one isotrap, but they overlap. So just say it includes an isotrap. It's good enough. Technically speaking, it has 2 isotraps. But don't let your technical details blur your ability to communicate the basic idea. Just call it 3 midpoints that includes an isotrap. If you say it's a Sun makes 3 midpoints that includes 2 isotraps, you might deceive the listener into thinking that all the planets are different from each other. I'm inclined to just say it's 3 midpoints that includes a midpoint that includes an isotrap, includes a midpoint isotrap. Okay, we can also say that the 3 midpoint structures includes a power isotrap. Ooh, that's even better. How cool is that? So I could say Sun makes 3 midpoint structures, and it includes a power isotrap. You could say power isotrap or midpoint isotrap. You don't need to say midpoint because we've already said it's a midpoint thing. So that the midpoints are forming isotraps. So I think a really great way, I love this way of describing it. The Sun makes 3 midpoint structures, and it includes a power isotrap. Wow, that really describes it very well, because that's what it's going to look like in the wheel. It's going to be Sun at Moon, Mercury, and Venus, Mars, and Mars is also conjunct Jupiter. So visually, that's what's going on. So using the word power really helps here. So, you may not think of all these things. This is why these are videos, these 8 videos on terminology and notation. The easiest way to see these things is with a midpoint tree. If you're writing it out, it's way difficult to understand because the midpoint tree is the way it looks in the chart. It's going to look like this in the chart. You can see the Sun with Moon on one side, Mercury on the other. Well, maybe Mercury's on the other side, but it doesn't matter whether Mercury's on the left and Moon is on the right. It doesn't matter in terms of interpretation for our purposes usually. So this actually looks like what you're seeing. What's not obvious here is that Mars and Jupiter are actually conjunct. It is obvious once you get used to it because you got Venus repeated. Venus is one thing. So after a while, you realize that the midpoint tree is a picture of the wheel. You'll see Moon and Mercury. You'll see Venus and Mars, and you'll see Mars conjunct Jupiter. Maybe the Venus and Mars are closer to the Sun than the Moon, Mercury. It's not a perfect image, and we don't need it to be a perfect image. It's better to put them in planetary order, so it's simple to relate to. My point is this. When you get used to looking at these midpoint trees, you look at it and you go, let's see, Sun makes 3 midpoints. There's an isotrap. Oh, in fact, it's a power isotrap. Because you see Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars. Ah, that's an isotrap. Oh, Venus gets repeated again, a power isotrap. So anyway, that is a fantastic way to describe it. The Sun makes 3 midpoint structures and includes a power isotrap. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing you how to use what we learned before in actual context. Another way to say it, we could say there are 3 midpoint structures, includes an isotrap, and one of the points of the isotrap is a conjunction of 2 planets. Whew! So if you don't think of using the word power, this is still very descriptive. The Sun makes 3 midpoint structures and includes an isotrap, and one of the points of the isotraps is a conjunction of 2 planets. It's a lot, you start getting lost. Go to the previous one. The Sun makes 3 midpoint structures and includes a power isotrap. You see how that word power is very helpful to condense what you're saying and convey the image more directly, succinctly, and clearly. So this language really works as you get used to it. It really helps you convey a visualization of the pattern. Okay, so we're just learning clever ways to describe things. If you don't think of the most clever way to describe things, no problem. You don't have to, get anxious about any of this. It's just the terminology is there, and you'll grow into it gradually and start to use it more naturally and more quickly and be able to describe these configurations very succinctly. So the conclusion is there's not always one way to describe something, but there are a limited number of ways to describe a planetary configuration in a clear and concise way. Okay, so as we look at these patterns, we learn, nice ways to describe them. Here, let's practice this again. So here's a midpoint configuration. Neptune equals Mars-Saturn midpoint, and equals Saturn-Pluto midpoint. It's easier to relate to when you just look at the tree diagram. How would you describe this midpoint configuration? It's very straightforward. Actually, you can get a little tongue-tied on this one too. How are you going to explain it? Let's see some ideas. So one idea, and here's the actual configuration. Neptune is at the Mars-Saturn midpoint and the Saturn-Pluto midpoint. Well, you could say, first of all, Neptune makes 2 midpoint structures. Well, it does, but if you just say that and you don't say any more, a person might think it's a midpoint isotrap, and it isn't. Saturn's in both midpoints, so it is not a midpoint isotrap. So just saying Neptune makes 2 midpoint structures is true, but a little confusing. I don't know if it's a midpoint isotrap or if there's a power thing going on. So let's try another one. I could describe it as Neptune conjunct the midpoint of a planet and the conjunction of two other planets. That's, if you look at the actual wheel, Neptune is conjunct the midpoint of a planet and the conjunction of two other planets. That's great if you can think of that. I think it's still a little hard to follow. I like this one better than the first two. Neptune makes two midpoint structures, and it is a power pattern. Fine. Good. I got it. Maybe it's not the perfect description, but if you get too involved, you can get lost. So it makes two midpoint structures. I got it. Neptune is at the top of the tree. There are two midpoint structures. It's a power pattern. Okay, it's not an isotrap thing. It's a conjunction thing. That's good enough to get across the point. And here's my favorite of all, but I really like that one. I think that's a very good description. Let's see. Neptune makes two midpoint structures in a power midpoint pattern. Ooh, that's cool. Neptune makes two midpoint structures in a power midpoint pattern. That really makes it totally clear. A power midpoint pattern. Remember, power just means a conjunction. But I like to say how many midpoint structures there are right up front. Neptune makes two midpoint structures. And it's a power midpoint pattern. That means it's power midpoint, it's not an isotrap. You're assuming the listener understands VA. So what we're talking about here is applying these basic principles in actual planetary configurations still can leave you a little bit tongue-tied if you want to describe it in a concise way. What most people do is they don't even use this terminology. They just say Neptune is conjunct the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and they would typically reverse the Pluto-Saturn so that you get the Saturn emphasis. Neptune is conjunct Mars-Saturn midpoint and Pluto-Saturn midpoint. Let me say that again. Neptune is conjunct the Mars-Saturn midpoint and the Pluto-Saturn midpoint. You hear Saturn twice? That's actually a beautiful way to describe it. You hear Saturn twice and you know it's a power configuration. And I think putting the planet that's the same, Saturn in this case, on the same either first or second helps get that across to people. Especially if you're saying it, you can emphasize it. Like if I put Saturn first, I could say Neptune is at the Saturn-Mars midpoint and the Saturn-Pluto midpoint. Gets across the idea. Okay, so yeah, that's it. This has been okay. We reached the end. 8 videos. So this is what we have here in these 8 videos is a comprehensive description of the terminology, notation, and planetary patterns as of June 2021. There are some terms that have been used in the past that have been simplified, as I've mentioned. There may be some terms of notation that may have been overlooked, and there will be more terms in the future. We hope that there won't be many changes in the future to the existing terminology and the notation, but if important improvements are found, it may be necessary. This is where we're at right now with this. So that's it, my friends. That's the terminology that we're employing at this point in the summer of 2021. I think this is going to stay pretty stable. We'll probably think of some additional things. We've gone through some changes, but this keeps it really simple and with words that are easier to say than some of the other things we came up with. Okay, that's it, my friends. Thank you very much for listening. God bless. Namaste.